Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager. Tonight we're diving into something that smells worse than your college roommate's laundry pile and sounds more disgusting than your uncle's fishing stories. The great stink of 1858, when London literally became a toilet bowl. Not metaphorically, literally. We're talking about a summer so foul, so putrid, so overwhelmingly disgusting that Parliament nearly shut down because lawmakers couldn't breathe without gagging. Forget your morning coffee breath. This was an entire city marinating in its own waste under a scorching sun. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and someone's always awake thinking about Victorian sewage. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe grab some air freshener because metaphorically speaking, things are about to get rank. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in a city where the river was basically an open sewer? Where throwing your chamber pot into the street was considered normal disposal? Where cholera outbreaks were just part of the summer schedule, like pool parties but deadlier? Could you survive a heatwave in a city with no plumbing, no sewers, and approximately zero understanding of germ theory? Would you last a single day navigating streets slick with human waste, breathing air so thick with stench that people soaked handkerchiefs in lavender just to leave their homes? And how exactly did one of the world's greatest empires let its capital city become an open-air latrine? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in London, 1858, the year everything goes sideways, or more accurately flows sideways directly into the Thames. You have no running water, a bucket for a toilet, and the entire city smells like death mixed with rotting vegetables and a hint of despair. The sun is out, the temperature is rising, and so is the river. Good luck. The River Thames wasn't always London's greatest embarrassment, but by 1858 it had become a flowing monument to human filth. For centuries, Londoners had treated the river like a convenient garbage disposal, tossing in dead animals, industrial waste, human excrement, and basically anything they didn't want cluttering up their homes. What had once been a vital trade route teeming with fish was now a thick brown soup of biological horror. The Thames didn't flow so much as ooze, carrying with it the concentrated waste of over 2 million people, all of whom believed the solution to pollution was dilution. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Picture this. You're standing on London Bridge in the summer of 1858, looking down at the river, except you can't actually look for long because your eyes are watering from the stench. The water below isn't blue or even grey, it's a disturbing shade of brown-green, thick as gravy, with a surface that seems to shimmer with an oily film. Objects float past that you desperately try not to identify. Is that a dead rat? A shoe? Something worse? You don't want to know. The Thames had become what scientists would delicately call anoxic, meaning there was no oxygen left in the water. Nothing could live there. The fish were long gone, driven away or dead. Even the plants along the riverbank looked sickly, as if they too were trying to escape. The river that had once been London's pride, its highway of commerce, its connection to the world, was now an open sewer stretching through the heart of the empire's capital. But here's the thing, it didn't happen overnight. This was decades in the making. Every time someone emptied a chamber pot out a window, every time a factory dumped chemical waste, Every time a new flush toilet sent its contents directly into the river, it all added up. Londoners watched their river die slowly, and most of them shrugged. Out of sight, out of mind. As long as the waste flowed away, technically, who cared where it went? The irony is almost poetic. The Thames was both London's toilet and its drinking fountain. Water companies drew water from the river, ran it through some basic filters that did essentially nothing, and piped it back to homes across the city. People drank it, cooked with it, bathed in it. Then they sent their waste right back to the same river. It was a closed loop of horror, a recycling system no one asked for. By the mid-19th century, the Thames was so polluted that simply being near it could make you sick. The smell alone caused nausea. Some claim the air near the river was thick, almost visible, like a fog made of rot. People reported headaches, dizziness, and an overwhelming urge to vomit just from crossing a bridge. And this wasn't a few sensitive souls complaining, this was everyone. Rich, poor, young, old, it didn't matter. The Thames had become universally disgusting, and still, for years, no one did anything substantial about it. There were half-hearted attempts, pouring lime into the river to neutralise the smell, dredging certain sections, building a few drains, but these were band-aids on a gaping wound. The real problem was systemic. London had grown too fast, built too little infrastructure, and ignored the consequences until the consequences became impossible to ignore. The Thames wasn't just a river anymore. It was a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when cities prioritise growth over planning, profit over people, and convenience over consequences. And in the summer of 1858, that warning finally became too loud, too smelly, and too deadly to ignore any longer. If you think your apartment's plumbing is bad, imagine living in a city where plumbing meant a pipe that dumped directly into the river you drank from. Victorian London's infrastructure was a patchwork nightmare of cesspits, open ditches and primitive water closets that all led to one place, the Thames. The invention of the flush toilet ironically made things worse. Suddenly, instead of waste sitting in cesspits to be eventually carted away, it was being flushed directly into the river at unprecedented volumes. Nobody planned for this. Nobody thought it through. And by the summer of 1858, the entire city was paying the price for decades of denial, neglect, and truly impressive levels of short-sighted municipal planning. Let's talk about how Victorian plumbing actually worked, or more accurately, how it spectacularly failed to work. Most homes, especially older ones, weren't connected to any kind of centralised system. Instead, they had cesspits, basically big holes dug beneath or beside the house where waste accumulated. These pits were lined with brick or stone, but they leaked constantly. Liquid waste seeped into the surrounding soil, contaminating wells, basements, and neighbouring properties. In wealthier homes, these cesspits were emptied regularly by night soil men, workers who came after dark to shovel out the contents and cart them away. Where did it go? Sometimes to farms as fertiliser, sometimes just dumped in the Thames anyway. It was a disgusting job, and the men who did it were social outcasts, thus paid barely enough to risk the smell and disease that came with the work. Poorer homes couldn't afford regular cesspit emptying, so they just waited, and waited, until the pit overflowed, which it inevitably did, usually into the street or the basement. Entire neighbourhoods reeked of sewage, cellars filled with it, and there was nothing anyone could do except move, if they could afford to, which most couldn't. Then came the flush toilet, which seemed like a miracle. Pull a lever and your waste disappears. Clean, modern, sanitary. Except no one asked where it was disappearing to. The early flush toilets were connected to existing cesspits, which couldn't handle the sudden increase in liquid waste. Cesspits overflowed faster, so engineers started connecting toilets directly to storm drains and old sewers, which all emptied into the Thames. Suddenly, instead of waste slowly accumulating in pits, it was rushing into the river in a constant flow. The Thames, which had always received some waste, was now receiving all of it, all at once, from every newly installed flush toilet across the city. It was like upgrading from a leaky faucet to a fire hose, pointed directly at your drinking water supply. Victorian engineers genuinely believed the river could handle it. They assumed the current would carry waste downstream and out to sea, diluting it harmlessly. They were catastrophically wrong. The Thames moved slowly, especially at low tide, and with millions of gallons of sewage pouring in daily, there was no dilution, just accumulation. The river became a slow-moving cesspool, growing more toxic with every flush. Making matters worse, London had multiple water companies, and each drawing water from different points along the Thames. Some drew from upstream, before most of the city's waste entered the river. Others drew from downstream, right in the middle of the pollution zone. Guess which neighbourhoods got which water? Wealth determined whether you drank relatively clean water or liquid sewage with a hint of Thames. By 1858, Victorian plumbing wasn't just inadequate, it was actively killing people. Every flush, every drain, every overflowing cesspit was contributing to a public health disaster. And the worst part? Everyone knew it was a problem. Engineers had been warning about it for years. The system was broken, overwhelmed and dangerous. But fixing it would cost money, require coordination, and demand that people confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress without planning is just chaos with better marketing. Before flush toilets became fashionable, Londoners relied on cesspits, basically underground pits where waste accumulated until someone came to dig it out. Lovely. These cesspits leaked constantly, seeping into basements, contaminating wells, and generally making life smell like a Renaissance fair porta potty at hour 12. Wealthier homes had them emptied regularly by night soil men, workers who carted away human waste under cover of darkness because even Victorians had some shame. Poorer families just hoped for the best. Chamber pots were the backup plan, and their contents were often tossed directly out windows into the street below with maybe a shouted warning if you were polite. Streets were slick, smelly, and teeming with disease. But hey, at least rent was affordable. Let's start with the cesspit, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. Most homes had one, a pit dug somewhere on the property, usually near the house, sometimes literally beneath it. You'd do your business in a privy or indoor closet, and it would drop down into this pit. Out of sight, out of mind. Except it was never really out of mind because you could smell it. Always. Especially in summer. The problem with cesspits is that they're essentially just holes in the ground. Even when lined with brick or stone, they leaked. Human waste is mostly liquid, and liquid finds a way. It seeped into the surrounding soil, saturating the ground, contaminating underground water sources, and occasionally bubbling up in basements during heavy rain. Imagine your cellar flooding. But instead of rainwater, it's sewage. Welcome to Victorian London. Wealthier families hired night soil men to empty their cesspits every few months. These workers arrived after dark, not because the work was illegal, but because even Victorians understood that shoveling human waste out of a pit was best done when respectable society wasn't watching. The men worked by lantern light, using shovels and buckets to haul out the accumulated filth. It was back-breaking, nauseating work, and it paid terribly. But someone had to do it. The contents were loaded onto carts and taken somewhere, officially, to farms outside the city to be used as fertiliser. Unofficially, sometimes just dumped in the Thames after dark. Because why pay to transport it all the way out of the city when there's a perfectly good river right there? Poorer families couldn't afford regular cesspit service, so they waited until the pit was literally overflowing before doing anything about it. And by then, it was often too late. Waste spilled into streets, courtyards, and shared alleyways. Entire tenements reeked of sewage. Residents tiptoed through filth just to get to their front doors. And complaining to a landlord was pointless. If you didn't like it, there were 10 other families happy to take your room. Then there were chamber pots, the portable option for nighttime emergencies or homes without privies. These ceramic or metal bowls were kept under beds, used during the night, and then emptied in the morning. Where? Into the cesspit, if you were organised. Into the street if you weren't. Tossing chamber pot contents out the window was so common that people developed a sort of etiquette around it. You were supposed to shout "Gardez l'eau," French for watch out for the water, before tossing. But in practice, most people just flung and hoped for the best. Walking down a London street in the early 19th century meant navigating puddles you didn't want to identify, stepping around suspicious piles, and constantly looking up to avoid incoming projectiles. Shoes were ruined regularly, hems of dresses were perpetually stained. And if you slipped and fell, well, let's just say laundry day became very important. By the mid-1800s, this system, if you could even call it a system, was collapsing under the weight of London's population boom. There were simply too many people producing too much waste for cesspits and chamber pots to handle. The infrastructure that had worked, barely, for a city of a few 100,000 couldn't cope with over 2 million. Something had to change. But until it did, Londoners just kept digging deeper pits, tossing fuller pots, and pretending everything was fine. It wasn't. Cholera didn't knock politely. It kicked down doors and killed thousands before anyone understood why. London suffered multiple devastating cholera outbreaks in the 19th century, 1832, 1849, 1854, each one more horrifying than the last. The disease caused violent diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration so severe that victims could die within hours. The worst part. No one knew what caused it. The prevailing theory was miasma. Bad air. Doctors genuinely believed that diseases floated around on stinky breezes. So while Londoners blamed the smell, they kept drinking water drawn directly from the sewage-filled Thames. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow famously traced an outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street that the truth began to dawn. Cholera wasn't airborne, it was waterborne, and London was swimming in it. The first cholera epidemic hit London in 1832, and it was unlike anything the city had seen before. People went to bed healthy and woke up dying. The disease struck without warning, turning victims into hollow-eyed shadows within hours. They suffered violent cramps, uncontrollable diarrhea, and vomiting so severe that they became dangerously dehydrated. Their skin turned blue-grey, their eyes sank into their skulls, and their bodies grew cold to the touch, all while they were still alive. It looked like something from a nightmare. Over 6,000 Londoners died in that first wave alone. Doctors had no idea what was happening. They prescribed everything from bloodletting to opium to brandy. Nothing worked. People died in their beds, in the streets, in workhouses. Bodies piled up faster than grave diggers could bury them. Panic spread almost as fast as the disease. Neighbourhoods were quarantined, markets shut down, and everyone desperately tried to understand why this was happening. The dominant medical theory of the time was miasma, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or foul odours. Since cholera seemed to strike hardest in the poorest, dirtiest neighbourhoods where the smell was worst, this theory seemed to make sense. Doctors recommended burning tar, lighting bonfires, and spreading lime to purify the air. Local authorities focused on eliminating smells. None of it helped, because the real problem wasn't the air, it was the water. But no one realised that yet. So when cholera returned in 1849, London was no more prepared than before. This time, over 14,000 people died. Entire families were wiped out. Streets fell silent as neighbours either fled or locked themselves inside. And still, doctors insisted it was miasma, bad air, moral failings, divine punishment, anything but the water. Then came 1854 and the Broad Street outbreak. In a single neighbourhood near Soho, over 500 people died within days. Dr. John Snow, a physician who'd long suspected cholera was waterborne, investigated. He mapped every case and interviewed survivors and traced the outbreak to a single source, a public water pump on Broad Street. Families who drank from that pump got cholera. Families who didn't stayed healthy. It was damning evidence. Snow convinced local authorities to remove the pump handle, making it unusable. Almost immediately the outbreak slowed. But even then, skeptics argued it was coincidence. Miasma theory was too deeply entrenched. It would take another decade and another crisis before Snow's findings were fully accepted. What made cholera so terrifying wasn't just how deadly it was, but how random it seemed. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, young or old, moral or immoral. If you drank contaminated water, you were at risk. And in a city where water companies drew directly from the Thames, contaminated water was everywhere. So you could drink from your tap in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Survivors described the horror of watching loved ones die, unable to do anything to help. Mothers held dying children. Husbands buried wives. Entire families disappeared in a matter of days, and through it all the Thames kept flowing, carrying its deadly cargo downstream, upstream, and into the pipes that fed London's homes. Cholera was proof that London's sanitation system, or lack thereof, was a ticking time bomb. But proof isn't enough when people are invested in denial. It would take one final overwhelming crisis to force the city to finally confront the truth. They were drinking their own death. Victorian Londoners were convinced that disease came from bad smells, not germs, smells. This theory, called miasma, dominated medical thinking for centuries and led to some truly baffling public health decisions. If it stank, it was dangerous. If it didn't stink, you were probably fine. This is why people carried nosegays, burned incense, and doused themselves in perfume, not for fashion, but for survival. Ironically, the miasma theory wasn't entirely wrong. The places that smelled the worst were often disease-ridden, but correlation isn't causation, and by focusing on odour instead of sanitation, authorities missed the real problem: contaminated water. Still, when the Great Stink hit in 1858, the miasma theory suddenly became very convenient. If bad air caused disease, then the apocalyptic stench rising from the Thames was, by Victorian logic, a public health emergency. Finally, something everyone could agree on, the city smelled like death and something had to be done. Miasma theory had ancient roots, dating back to Greek and Roman medicine. The basic idea was simple. Disease was caused by corrupt air rising from decaying matter, swamps, or filth. If you breathed bad air, you got sick. The worse the smell, the more dangerous the air. It made a certain kind of intuitive sense, after all. Places that smelled terrible were often unhealthy. Swamps bred disease. Sewage-filled streets were hotbeds of illness. But the theory confused correlation with causation, and that mistake cost lives. Victorian doctors took miasma theory seriously. They prescribed fresh air, open windows, and clean linens. They recommended burning aromatic herbs or hanging bags of camphor to purify the atmosphere. During cholera outbreaks, they lit bonfires in the streets, convinced that fire would cleanse the poisonous air. None of it worked because the real culprit, contaminated water, was being completely ignored. The problem was that miasma theory offered a convenient scapegoat. If disease came from bad air, then individual responsibility was minimal. You couldn't be blamed for breathing, and authorities could focus on superficial fixes, cleaning streets, improving ventilation, eliminating odours, without addressing the underlying infrastructure failures that were actually killing people. Wealthy Victorians embraced miasma theory because it allowed them to distance themselves from disease. They lived in well-ventilated homes on higher ground, away from the worst smells. Surely they were safe. Meanwhile, the poor, crammed into low-lying slums near the river, suffered disproportionately. Miasma theory reinforced class prejudices. If disease came from bad air and bad air came from filth, then the poor were literally poisoning the atmosphere just by existing. But here's the irony. When the Great Stink arrived in 1858, miasma theory suddenly became useful. For years, reformers had been trying to convince Parliament to fund sewer construction. They'd presented studies, death tolls, and expert testimony. Nothing worked. It was too expensive, too complicated, too unpleasant to think about. But when the Thames began producing a smell so unbearable that MPs couldn't function, suddenly miasma theory made sewer reform urgent. If bad air caused disease, and the Thames was producing the worst air anyone had ever smelled, then clearly something had to be done immediately. The irony is delicious. The same theory that had blocked progress by focusing on symptoms rather than causes became the political tool that finally forced action. MPs weren't suddenly enlightened about germ theory or contaminated water supplies. They just couldn't stand the smell. And if they believed that smell could kill them, then by God they'd fund whatever it took to make it stop. Miasma theory also shaped how the sewers were designed. Bazalgette's system included elaborate ventilation shafts and air channels, meant to disperse sewer gases safely above street level. These features weren't medically necessary. Sewer gas won't give you cholera, but they made people feel safer. And sometimes perception matters as much as reality when you're trying to convince a skeptical public to support massive infrastructure spending. It wasn't until the 1860s and 1870s that germ theory began to replace miasma. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, not bad air. But even then, old beliefs died hard. Many doctors continued to hedge their bets, treating diseases as if both theories might be true. Looking back, miasma theory seems almost comically wrong, but it's a reminder that even smart, educated people can be completely mistaken about fundamental truths, and sometimes the wrong theory can still lead to the right outcome as long as someone stinks badly enough to force action. In the early 1800s, London's population exploded. People flooded in from the countryside looking for work in factories, docks and shops. By 1858, over 2 million souls were crammed into a city that had been designed for maybe half that many, and designed is a generous word. There was no zoning, no urban planning, no coordinated infrastructure. Houses were built on top of old cesspits. Streets were narrow and filthy. And every single one of those 2 million people needed to eat, drink, and most importantly expel waste. The math was brutal. More people meant more sewage. More sewage meant fuller cesspits. Fuller cesspits meant overflow. Overflow meant streets, basements, and eventually the Thames became one giant open toilet. London had grown too fast and built too little, and by the summer of 1858, the city was quite literally overflowing with its own success. Let's talk numbers. In 1800, London's population was roughly 1 million people. That's already a massive city by historical standards, one of the largest in the world at the time. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and everything changed. Factories sprung up, jobs multiplied, and suddenly people from all over Britain were streaming into the city looking for work, opportunity, and a better life. By 1850, London's population had doubled to over 2 million. By 1858, it was closer to 2.5 million. That's 1.5 million new people in less than 60 years. Imagine adding the equivalent of several large cities' worth of people to an infrastructure that was already struggling. It wasn't sustainable. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Where did all these people live? Anywhere they could. Slums expanded rapidly, with entire families crammed into single rooms. Courtyards that had once held a few homes were subdivided and subdivided again, creating labyrinthine warrens of overcrowded housing. Buildings went up quickly and cheaply, with no regard for sanitation, ventilation or safety. Developers were interested in profit, not public health. And here's the thing. Every single one of those new residents needed to use the bathroom multiple times a day. That's millions of additional gallons of human waste being produced daily, with nowhere for it to go. The cesspit system, which had barely worked for a smaller population, collapsed entirely under the weight of the boom. Cesspits overflowed constantly. Neighbourhoods that had once been tolerable became uninhabitable. Streets that had been merely dirty became rivers of sewage, and the Thames, which had served as London's unofficial sewer for centuries, was suddenly receiving waste on a scale it had never experienced before. Making matters worse, the population boom was concentrated in certain areas. The East End, closest to the docks and factories, absorbed the majority of new arrivals. This created pockets of extreme overcrowding where sanitation systems, already inadequate, were completely overwhelmed. Some courts and alleys housed hundreds of people sharing a single privy and a single water pump. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions. But the wealthy areas weren't immune either. London was still a compact city, with rich and poor neighbourhoods often separated by just a few streets. Waste didn't respect class boundaries. Contaminated water flowed underground, crossing property lines and infecting wells in even respectable neighbourhoods. The Thames flowed through the entire city, carrying pollution upstream and downstream, making no distinction between elegant Chelsea and squalid Southwark. The population boom also strained London's water supply. More people meant more demand for water, for drinking, cooking, washing, and eventually flushing toilets. Water companies struggled to keep up. They laid more pipes, built more reservoirs, and drew more water from the Thames. But they didn't treat it properly. They didn't build the infrastructure necessary to separate clean water from waste. It was a system designed for crisis. By 1858, London had become a case study in unsustainable urban growth. Yet the city had welcomed millions of new residents without building the systems necessary to support them. It had prioritised economic growth over public health, expansion over planning, profit over people. And now everyone, rich and poor, new arrivals and old families, was paying the price. The lesson was clear, though it took a crisis to learn it. Cities can't grow indefinitely without infrastructure. Population booms require planning, investment, and a willingness to build the unglamorous systems, sewers, water treatment, waste management that keep cities livable. London failed that test in the 1850s, and in the summer of 1858 the bill came due, delivered in the form of a smell so terrible it stopped the empire in its tracks. The flush toilet was supposed to be a triumph for Victorian ingenuity, a modern sanitary solution to the age-old problem of human waste. And in theory it was brilliant. Pull a handle, waste disappears, magic. Unfortunately, no one thought about where all that waste was going. Spoiler, it went straight into the Thames. Before flush toilets, waste sat in cesspits and was eventually hauled away. Gross, yes, but at least it stayed somewhat contained. Once flushing became popular, waste flooded into the river faster than anyone had anticipated. Suddenly, the Thames wasn't just receiving London's waste, it was drowning in it. The invention that was supposed to make life cleaner instead turned the river into a flowing cesspool. By 1858, the flush toilet had become less of a convenience and more of a weapon of mass pollution. Let's give credit where it's due. The flush toilet was a genuinely revolutionary invention. For centuries, people had been using chamber pots, outhouses and cesspits, all of which required someone to physically handle, transport or live near human waste. The flush toilet promised to make all of that disappear with a simple pull of a chain. No smell, no mess, no contact. It was the Victorian dream of progress made real. The basic mechanism was elegant, a reservoir of water positioned above the toilet bowl. Pull a handle, and gravity sent water rushing down, washing waste through a pipe and into well, somewhere else. That somewhere else was the problem no one wanted to think about too carefully. Early flush toilets, developed in the late 18th century and popularised in the early 19th, were initially connected to cesspits. In theory, this made sense. The waste would just go where it had always gone. But cesspits weren't designed to handle the massive increase in liquid waste that flushing produced. A single flush could use several gallons of water. Multiply that by multiple uses per day, multiple family members, and suddenly you're pouring dozens of gallons of liquid waste into a pit that was already full. Cesspits overflowed faster, much faster. Landlords and homeowners found themselves hiring night soil men constantly at great expense, and even then the pits couldn't keep up. So enterprising plumbers started connecting flush toilets directly to storm drains and old sewers, channels that had been built to carry rainwater, not sewage, and which all emptied directly into the Thames. This seemed like a clever solution at the time. The waste would flow away through existing drainage systems, out of sight and out of mind. No more overflowing cesspits, no more expensive emptying services. Problem solved. Except the problem wasn't solved at all, it was just relocated. Now, instead of waste accumulating slowly in pits, it was rushing into the Thames in a constant torrent. And here's the kicker. The more civilized you were, the worse the problem became. Wealthy neighborhoods adopted flush toilets quickly because they could afford them. These were the same neighborhoods that prided themselves on cleanliness and modernity. But by installing flush toilets, they were pumping vastly more waste into the river than poorer neighborhoods still using chamber pots and cesspits. The rich, in their pursuit of comfort, were inadvertently poisoning the water supply faster than anyone else. The flush toilet also changed people's habits. With cesspits, there was at least some incentive to conserve waste. Overfilling meant expensive emptying. But with flush toilets, waste was infinite. Use the toilet as often as you want. No consequences. The psychological shift was subtle but significant. Waste became invisible. Someone else's problem, abstracted away by the miracle of modern plumbing. By the 1850s, flush toilets were spreading rapidly across London. They were seen as a mark of respectability, a sign that a household was modern and progressive. Advertisements touted their convenience and hygiene. Plumbers made good money installing them, and the Thames quietly absorbed the consequences. No one in government regulated this. There were no building codes requiring proper sewage treatment, no inspections to ensure toilets were connected to appropriate systems, no oversight whatsoever. It was plumbing anarchy, guided by nothing but individual convenience and profit motive. The bitter irony is that flush toilets could have been a genuine improvement if they'd been paired with proper infrastructure. If London had built sewers first, then introduced flush toilets as part of a planned system, everything would have been fine. But it's not what happened. Instead, the toilets came first, infrastructure second, and the Thames paid the price. By 1858, the flush toilet had become a symbol of everything wrong with the Victorian progress. Brilliant in isolation, disastrous in practice, adopted for convenience without regard for consequences. For it was innovation without planning, comfort without responsibility, and the river, which had sustained London for centuries, was now choking on the byproducts of modernity, one flush at a time. For centuries the Thames was London's highway. Watermen ferried passengers across its surface. Dock workers unloaded ships, fishermen cast nets, and merchants traded goods along its banks. But by 1858, working on the Thames meant working in hell. The smell was unbearable. The water was thick, discoloured, and dotted with unidentifiable floating objects you definitely didn't want to identify. Fishermen had long since given up. Nothing lived in that water anymore. Watermen wrapped cloth around their faces and rowed quickly, trying not to breathe too deeply. Dock workers developed chronic coughs and stomach ailments. Still, they kept working. Bills didn't pay themselves, and complaining about the smell was like complaining about the weather. Pointless. Everyone knew the Thames was disgusting. But for the working class, disgust was just another occupational hazard. Let's talk about the watermen first, the taxi drivers of the Thames. For generations, these skilled boatmen had made their living rowing passengers across the river or up and down its length. Before bridges became common, watermen were essential. Need to get from Southwark to Westminster? Hire a waterman. Want to travel downstream to Greenwich? Waterman. They were licensed, regulated, and generally respected members of the working class. But by the 1850s, their profession had become a nightmare. Every shift meant spending hours on the water, surrounded by the smell of sewage, his breathing air thick with decay. Watermen wore scarves soaked in vinegar or cologne wrapped around their faces, trying desperately to filter the stench. Some chewed mint or tobacco constantly, anything to overwhelm their sense of smell. It helped, but not much. The water itself had become dangerous. It was no longer clear enough to see through, which made navigating tricky. You couldn't spot submerged debris or shallow areas until you hit them. The surface was often covered with a greasy film that stuck to oars and clothes, and the things floating past, well, let's just say watermen developed a strict policy of not looking too closely at anything bobbing in the water. Passengers complained constantly. "How do you stand it?" they'd ask, handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. Watermen just shrugged. You got used to it, or you didn't, and you found another job. But other jobs weren't easy to come by, so most watermen just endured day after miserable day, rowing through what was essentially an open sewer. Then there were the dock workers, men who unloaded ships along the Thames industrial stretches. These weren't pleasure boats. They were cargo vessels carrying goods from round the empire. The docks were noisy, chaotic, and lucrative. But they were also directly adjacent to the most polluted sections of the river. Dock workers spent their days in the thick of it, hauling cargo while the sun baked the river banks and intensified the smell. They developed what they called river cough, a chronic respiratory condition from breathing polluted air all day. Stomach problems were common too, probably from contaminated drinking water or just constant exposure to filth, and some workers swore the smell alone could make you sick. But dock work paid relatively well, at least by working class standards, so men showed up, wrapped rags around their faces, and got to work. What choice did they have? Families needed feeding. Rent needed paying. And if that meant breathing poison for 8 hours a day, well, that was just the cost of survival in Victorian London. Fishermen, meanwhile, had been driven out entirely. The Thames had once been famous for its salmon, its eels, its thriving fish populations. Fishermen made decent livings catching and selling fresh river fish at London's markets. But by the 1850s, the fish were gone. Nothing could survive in water that toxic. Fishermen either switched professions or moved to coastal areas. The river that had fed them for generations was now completely dead. Ironically, some workers found opportunity in the pollution. Mudlarks, usually children or desperate adults, waded through the Thames' toxic shallows at low tide, scavenging for anything valuable that had been dropped or discarded. Coins, nails, bits of metal, bones for making glue, anything that could be sold. It was dangerous, disgusting work. The mud was thick and sticky, sometimes hiding sharp debris or deep pockets that could trap an unwary scavenger. And the mud itself was contaminated with sewage, industrial chemicals, and who knows what else. Mudlarks frequently got infections, cuts that wouldn't heal, and mysterious illnesses. But it was income, however meagre, and for the desperately poor that was enough. The Thames had become a class marker. The wealthy could avoid it entirely. Yes, living in neighbourhoods far from the river or travelling by carriage across bridges high above the water. But the working class, watermen, dock workers, mudlarks, riverside factory workers, had no escape. The river was their workplace, their livelihood, and their prison. They couldn't afford to leave, couldn't afford to complain too loudly, and certainly couldn't afford to stop working just because the water smelled like death. So they wrapped cloth around their faces, took shallow breaths, and kept rowing, lifting and scavenging. Because in Victorian London, the smell of money often came with the actual smell of sewage, and if you wanted to survive, you learned to tolerate both. For years, London's elite had managed to insulate themselves from the worst of the city's sanitation crisis. They lived in nicer neighbourhoods, drank filtered water, and employed servants to deal with unpleasant realities. But there was one thing they couldn't escape: location. The Houses of Parliament sat directly on the banks of the Thames, and in the summer of 1858, that became a very serious problem. As temperatures soared and the river's water level dropped, the stench intensified to unbearable levels. MPs gagged during debates. Windows were draped with curtains soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to block the smell. Committees discussed relocating Parliament entirely, maybe to Oxford, maybe to literally anywhere that didn't smell like an open sewer. For the first time, the people in power were forced to breathe the same air as everyone else. And suddenly, sewage reform became a top priority. The Palace of Westminster, a home to the Houses of Parliament, is an architectural marvel, Gothic revival splendour built to showcase British power and prestige. It sits majestically on the north bank of the Thames, offering commanding views of the river. Under normal circumstances, this location was perfect, symbolic, accessible, impressive. But in the summer of 1858, it became a curse. Picture this. You're a member of Parliament, dressed in formal attire, heavy wool suit, starched collar, waistcoat, sitting in a stuffy committee room in the middle of a heatwave. The windows are open because there's no air conditioning, obviously, and wafting through those open windows is a smell so foul, so viscerally disgusting, that grown men are literally gagging mid-sentence. MPs tried everything. They ordered the windows closed, but then the rooms became unbearably hot, and people started fainting from the heat. They hung curtains soaked in chloride of lime, a chemical used to neutralize odours, but the smell seeped through anyway. They burned incense, poured perfume and lit aromatic candles. Nothing worked. The Thames was too close, the smell too strong, the summer too hot. Debates became farcical. MPs would be mid-speech when a particularly strong gust of river air would send them reeling. Handkerchiefs became mandatory accessories, held over noses and mouths like masks. Attendance dropped. Many MPs simply stopped showing up, claiming illness or urgent business elsewhere. Committee meetings were moved repeatedly, searching for rooms on the opposite side of the building as far from the river as possible. The press had a field day. Political cartoons showed MPs fleeing Parliament, holding their noses or being visibly overcome by the stench. One cartoon depicted Father Thames, the personification of the river, as a diseased, rotting figure presenting his gifts to the city. Another showed MPs debating whether to relocate to Oxford or St Albans, anywhere but London. The satire was brutal, but it resonated because it was true. The people in charge had finally encountered a problem they couldn't delegate or ignore. What made this particularly galling for MPs was the hypocrisy of it all. For years they'd ignored reports about cholera outbreaks, contaminated water, and overflowing cesspits in poor neighbourhoods. Those problems had seemed distant, abstract, someone else's concern. But now the problem was in their building, in their lungs, ruining their debates and making their workplace unbearable. Suddenly sanitation reform became urgent. Parliamentary debates that summer are almost comical to read. MPs who'd previously dismissed sewer proposals as too expensive or unnecessary now spoke passionately about the need for immediate action. One MP declared that the state of the Thames was a national disgrace. Another called it an emergency that threatens the very functioning of government. These were the same men who'd voted down sewer funding proposals just months earlier. There was even serious discussion about relocating Parliament permanently. Why not move to Oxford? Some suggested. Lovely town, clean air, far from the Thames. Others proposed Hampton Court or Windsor. The idea that the Empire's government might be driven out of its capital by a bad smell was both absurd and genuinely plausible in the summer of 1858. But relocation would have been expensive, logistically nightmarish, and deeply embarrassing. Imagine the headlines: British Parliament flees London due to smell. The international mockery alone would have been devastating. Britain was supposed to be the most advanced, civilized nation on earth, the heart of a global empire. And its government couldn't function because the river smelled bad. Unacceptable. So instead, Parliament did something it rarely did: acted quickly. The combination of personal discomfort, public humiliation, and genuine health concerns finally broke through decades of denial and procrastination. MPs who'd spent careers avoiding difficult decisions suddenly found themselves voting enthusiastically for massive infrastructure spending. Not because they'd suddenly become enlightened about public health, but because they personally couldn't stand the smell anymore. It was a perfect example of how change often happens, slowly, reluctantly, and only when the people in power personally suffer the consequences of inaction. The working class has been living with overflowing cesspits and contaminated water for decades. Nothing changed. But give Parliament 2 weeks of bad air and suddenly sewers became a top priority. Better late than never, perhaps. But the timing reveals exactly whose comfort mattered most in Victorian Britain. Summer in London is usually mild, rainy and grey, perfect weather for complaining about the weather. But the summer of 1858 was different. Temperatures soared into the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit, a genuine heatwave by British standards. Normally, this would have been cause for celebration: sun, warmth, picnics. But when you're living in a city that doubles as a giant toilet, a heatwave is a nightmare. The heat baked the streets, intensifying every foul odour. The Thames, already disgusting, began to ferment. Algae bloomed. Bacteria multiplied. The surface of the river grew thick and oily. And the smell. It wasn't just bad, it was apocalyptic. A physical presence that clung to clothing, hair and lungs. People vomited in the streets. Businesses shut their windows despite the heat. And Parliament, sitting right on the riverbank, was forced to confront the fact that London had become unlivable. Let's set the scene. It's June 1858, and Britain is experiencing one of the hottest summers in memory. Day after day, the sun beats down. There's no rain to cool things off, no clouds to offer relief. For most of Britain, this is delightful. Farmers love it. Holidaymakers flock to the seaside, and everyone enjoys the novelty of sustained sunshine. But London was suffering. The heat did something terrible to the Thames. At normal temperatures, the river's pollution was bad but somewhat manageable. The smell was always there, but it had become part of the background, like noise in a factory or smoke in the air. You noticed it, hated it, but learned to function despite it. But when temperatures spiked, the river transformed into something far worse. First, the water level dropped. Yeah, summer is naturally a low water season for the Thames as less rain feeds into it. But the 1858 heatwave made it worse. The river shrank, concentrating the pollution. What had been diluted somewhat by flowing water now sat in stagnant pools, baking in the sun. Second, the heat accelerated decomposition. All the organic waste in the river, human excrement, dead animals, food scraps, industrial byproducts, began breaking down faster. Bacteria thrived in the warm water, multiplying exponentially. Algae bloomed across the surface, turning sections of the river a sickly green, and the smell became something beyond description. People who lived through it struggled to put it into words. It wasn't like any normal bad smell, rotting garbage, manure, decay. It was all of those combined and amplified, a smell so overpowering it felt physical. Some described it as a living thing, a presence that invaded your lungs and throat. Others said it made them immediately nauseous, triggering a gag reflex just from breathing. Walking near the Thames became nearly impossible. People who had to cross bridges moved quickly, holding scarves or handkerchiefs soaked in perfume, vinegar or cologne over their faces. Even so, many doubled over, retching before they made it across. Street vendors near the river abandoned their posts. Who would buy food when the air smelled like death? Businesses shuttered their windows despite the sweltering heat. Better to suffer heat stroke indoors than open a window and let that smell in. Shops near the river saw business plummet. Hotels lost customers. Even pubs, normally crowded in any weather, were sat half empty because people couldn't stomach drinking while breathing that air. The heatwave lasted weeks, which meant the smell persisted too. It wasn't a one-day crisis that could be endured and forgotten. Every morning Londoners woke hoping it would be better, and every morning they stepped outside and were hit with the same wall of stench. It wore people down physically and psychologically. Sleep was difficult, windows had to stay closed, making homes unbearably hot. But opening them meant breathing in the reek, which made sleep impossible for different reasons. Health complaints skyrocketed. People reported headaches, dizziness, nausea, and respiratory problems. Some of this was undoubtedly psychosomatic. The miasma theory had convinced people that bad smells caused disease, so of course they felt sick. But some was real. Mere breathing air that polluted for weeks on end couldn't have been healthy. Respiratory infections spread. Doctors' offices filled with patients complaining of a river fever or Thames throat. Children suffered especially. They didn't understand why they couldn't play outside, why the adults were so angry and stressed, why the whole world suddenly smelled so terrible. Families with means fled London entirely, retreating to country estates or seaside towns for the duration of the summer. Those who couldn't afford to leave just endured day after miserable day. The Thames itself looked as bad as it smelled. The low water exposed mudflats that were normally submerged, thick, oozing mud saturated with sewage. In the heat, these flats baked into a crusty surface that cracked and released even more odour. The river's surface was covered in a thick or oily film. Debris floated everywhere, wood, cloth, unidentifiable organic matter. Nothing moved. The water just sat there, stagnant and festering. By midsummer, London was in crisis mode. This wasn't just unpleasant anymore, it felt apocalyptic. People genuinely wondered if the city was dying, if the Thames had become permanently toxic, if London would ever be livable again. And through it all, the sun kept shining, the heat kept building, and the river kept reeking. The great stink of 1858 wasn't just a bad smell. It was a breaking point, the moment when decades of neglect, denial and short-sighted planning came crashing down. The heat had simply turned up the volume on a problem that had been growing for years, and finally, London was ready to listen. June 1858, the heatwave was in full swing, and then the smell hit. Not gradually, suddenly, violently, as if the river itself had decided it had had enough. Londoners woke up to a stench so overpowering that people genuinely believed the city was cursed. Newspapers called it the Great Stink, and the name stuck because nothing else could capture the sheer horror of it. Walking near the Thames was unbearable. Even streets blocks away reeked. People soaked handkerchiefs in cologne and pressed them to their faces just to survive their commute. The wealthy fled to the countryside. The poor, as always, had no choice but to endure. Businesses near the river reported drops in customers, not because people didn't want to shop, but because they physically couldn't stomach being near the water. The Great Stink wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-blown urban crisis. And for once, the everyone, rich, poor, powerful, powerless, agreed on one thing. Something had to change. The morning of June 10th is often cited as the day the Great Stink truly began, though in reality it had been building for days. But this was the morning when the smell became impossible to ignore, when it crossed from terrible to apocalyptic. People stepped outside and immediately staggered back, covering their faces. Some vomited right there on their doorsteps. It was as if someone had opened the gates of hell and forgotten to close them. The Thames had always smelled bad in summer, that was a given. But this was different. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was aggressive. The smell didn't just sit in the air, it attacked. It invaded homes through closed windows, it soaked into clothing and hair. People swore they could taste it. A foul coating on their tongue that no amount of tea or wine could wash away. It followed them everywhere, an invisible stalker that wouldn't relent. Panic spread almost as quickly as the smell. Parents kept children indoors, terrified that the bad air would make them sick. Remember, this was an era when people believed miasma, poisonous air, could kill. And if this wasn't poisonous air, what was? The smell felt dangerous, like breathing it might actually be fatal. Some people genuinely wondered if this was divine punishment, if God was finally tired of London's wickedness and corruption. The newspapers had a field day. Headlines screamed, "Great Stink engulfs. Capital and Thames becomes unbearable." Journalists competed to come up with the most creative descriptions. One compared it to Satan's breakfast breath. Another said it smelled like 10,000 rotting corpses marinated in sewage. The Times ran daily updates on the smell, measuring it not just in words but in public reaction. How many people vomited crossing Westminster Bridge? How many businesses closed? How many MPs fled Parliament? The press also seized the opportunity to mock the government. For years, newspapers had been calling for sewer reform, publishing editorials about cholera outbreaks and contaminated water. But Parliament had always found excuses, too expensive, too difficult, not urgent enough. Now, with MPs literally gagging in the House of Commons, the press delighted in pointing out the hypocrisy. One cartoon showed MPs holding their noses while ignoring a crowd of poor Londoners who'd been holding their noses for years. The caption read, "Funny how it only matters now." While public meetings were held across the city, citizens gathered to demand action, to share stories of unbearable conditions, to organise petitions. These weren't organised by politicians or reformers. They were spontaneous, grassroots eruptions of anger and frustration. People had had enough. The smell had become a rallying point, something everyone could unite against regardless of class, politics or religion. Even the usually divided press corps agreed. This was a crisis that demanded immediate action. Conservative papers and liberal papers, broadsheets and tabloids all sang the same tune. Fix the Thames or lose the city. It was that simple. Businesses suffered enormously. Shops near the river saw sales plummet by half or more. Who wants to buy a dress or a hat while fighting not to vomit? Restaurants and pubs emptied out. That even the most desperate alcoholic couldn't stomach drinking ale while breathing that air. Hotels lost tourists. Theatres cancelled performances because audiences wouldn't show up. The economic impact was massive and immediate. The wealthy, as always, had options. Those who owned country estates packed up and left, sometimes taking entire households, servants, children, even pets with them. For them, the great stink was an inconvenience, a reason to enjoy a longer summer holiday in cleaner air. But for the working class, there was no escape. They lived near the river, because housing was cheaper there. They worked near the river because that's where the jobs were, and they had no savings to fall back on if they stopped working. So while the rich fled, the poor endured. They wrapped rags around their faces and went to work. They breathed the poisonous air because they had no choice. And they watched with a mixture of satisfaction and bitterness as the people who'd ignored this problem for decades suddenly discovered it was real, urgent, and unbearable. The great stink had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until someone did something about it. For the first time in London's history, the entire city, from the poorest mudlark to the richest lord, was united in misery. The Thames had become everyone's problem, and finally that meant someone would have to solve it. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who'd been warning about London's sewage crisis for years. Unlike politicians who talked in circles, Bazalgette talked in blueprints, measurements, and cast-iron pipes. He'd already proposed an ambitious plan to completely overhaul London's sewer system, but it had been repeatedly delayed. Too expensive, too complicated, too unnecessary. Then came the great stink, and suddenly Bazalgette's unnecessary plan looked like the only thing standing between London and total collapse. Bazalgette's vision was revolutionary. Build an entirely new network of underground sewers that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream far past the city, where it could be released into the river without poisoning the capital. It required tunnelling under streets, redirecting ancient waterways, and constructing massive pumping stations. It was the Victorian equivalent of putting a man on the moon, and Bazalgette was ready. Joseph William Bazalgette was born in 1819 into a family of French descent. He trained as a civil engineer and working on railway projects across Britain before turning his attention to London's infrastructure. By the 1850s, he'd become chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, a position that gave him both authority and frustration. He had the technical knowledge to solve London's sewage crisis. He had detailed plans drawn up. What he didn't have was funding, political support, or anyone willing to listen. For years, Bazalgette had been proposing a comprehensive sewer system. Not patchwork repairs or half measures, but a complete reimagining of how London handled waste. His plan involved constructing massive underground tunnels, sewers large enough for a person to walk through, that would intercept waste from existing drains before it reached the Thames. These main sewers would run parallel to the river, and sloping gently downward, using gravity to carry waste eastward, downstream, far past the city centre. At strategic points, pumping stations would lift sewage when necessary, pushing it over hills or around obstacles, and at the end of the system, far downstream near the Thames estuary, the waste would be released into the river at high tide, allowing it to be carried out to sea. By the time the tide turned and brought water back upstream, the waste would be so diluted and distant that it wouldn't pose a threat to London's water supply. It was brilliant. It was also expensive, estimated to cost over £3 million, an astronomical sum at the time, and it was complicated, requiring engineering techniques that had never been attempted at this scale. So Parliament did what politicians do best. They delayed. Committees were formed. New reports were commissioned. Debates were held, and nothing happened. Bazalgette must have been incredibly frustrated. He could see the problem clearly. He had the solution mapped out in meticulous detail, but bureaucracy and budget concerns kept blocking him. MPs worried about the cost. Property owners worried about construction disrupting their land. And everyone operated under the assumption that the problem, while bad, wasn't urgent enough to justify such massive spending. Then came the great stink. Suddenly Bazalgette's proposals weren't being filed away for further study. They were being pulled out, dusted off, and presented to MPs who could barely breathe without gagging. The same politicians who dismissed his plans as too expensive now found themselves asking, "How quickly can we start? What do you need? Just build it. For God's sake." Bazalgette's plan wasn't just about sewers, it was about fundamentally redesigning London's relationship with the Thames. He proposed building embankments, raised walkways along the river's edge, that would serve multiple purposes. On top, beautiful promenades where people could walk and enjoy the river. Underneath, massive brick sewers carrying waste away from the city. And as a bonus, narrowing the river would speed its flow, helping flush remaining pollution downstream faster. He also insisted on building the sewers larger than current needs required. Critics called this wasteful, arguing that the extra capacity would never be needed. But Bazalgette was thinking long-term. He knew London's population would keep growing. Better to build big now than have to rebuild in 50 years. It was visionary thinking. And it paid off. His sewers still function today, over a century and a half later, serving a city many times larger than the one he designed them for. What made Bazalgette truly remarkable wasn't just his technical brilliance, though he had that in abundance. It was his persistence. For years he'd faced rejection, budget cuts and political interference. Lesser men would have given up, moved on to projects where their skills were appreciated, but Bazalgette believed in what he was doing. He knew his sewers could save lives, transform London, and prove that engineering could solve even the most overwhelming problems. When Parliament finally gave him the green light in July 1858, Bazalgette didn't waste time celebrating. He immediately began organising contractors, ordering materials and planning construction schedules. He'd waited years for this moment, and he wasn't going to let anything slow him down now. The great stink had created a window of opportunity, and Bazalgette was going to build an entire sewer system before that window closed. He was demanding as a boss, perfectionist as an engineer, and relentless as a project manager. Workers complained about his exacting standards. Measurements had to be precise, materials had to be perfect. Nothing was good enough for Bazalgette, but that perfectionism is why his sewers still work today. He wasn't building something temporary or just adequate. He was building infrastructure meant to last generations. Joseph Bazalgette didn't set out to be a hero. He was an engineer who saw a problem and wanted to fix it. But in doing so, he saved thousands of lives. Sir, transformed London from a disease-ridden nightmare into a modern city, and proved that sometimes the most important heroes are the ones who build things that work so well, we forget they're even there. For years, politicians had debated, delayed and deflected when it came to London's sewage problem. It was too expensive, too complicated, not urgent enough. But the Great Stink changed everything. With MPs literally gagging in the House of Commons and the press hammering them daily, Parliament had no choice but to act. In a shocking display of efficiency, they passed legislation in just 18 days, a record for a government body that usually took months to agree on anything. The bill authorised massive funding for Bazalgette's sewer project and gave him the power to begin construction immediately. It was nicknamed the Great Stink Bill, and it remains one of the fastest pieces of infrastructure legislation in British history. Funny how quickly politicians move when they can't breathe without gagging. Let's appreciate just how unprecedented this was. The British Parliament was, and still is, famous for moving slowly. Bills routinely took months or even years to pass. Committees studied issues endlessly. Debates dragged on through multiple sessions. Amendments were proposed, discussed, revised, and discussed again. The machinery of government ground forward at a glacial pace, especially when large sums of money were involved. But in July 1858, Parliament achieved something remarkable. They moved fast. On July 15th, just weeks into the Great Stink, Benjamin Disraeli, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Messrs, introduced emergency legislation to fund London's sewer construction. The bill authorised the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow £3 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, to build Bazalgette's proposed sewer system. And Parliament passed it in 18 days. 18 days. For context, that same Parliament had spent months debating far less important issues. But when MPS couldn't work because of the smell, suddenly legislative efficiency became possible. It's almost funny. Give politicians a personal reason to care and they can move mountains, or at least pass bills. The debates surrounding the legislation were surprisingly straightforward. Normally, spending bills triggered fierce arguments about cost, necessity, and whether taxpayers should foot the bill. But in 1858, those arguments evaporated. MPs who'd normally fight over every penny suddenly agreed that yes, £3 million was reasonable. Yes, immediate action was necessary. Yes, Bazalgette should have whatever he needed. Some MPs did try to slow things down. Old habits die hard. A few questioned whether the money might be better spent elsewhere, or whether perhaps a smaller, cheaper project might suffice. But they were shouted down, sometimes literally. One MP reportedly stood to argue for delay and was interrupted by another who snapped, "Sit down, man! Can't you smell it?" The chamber erupted in laughter, and the objection was withdrawn. The press covered the debates with glee, noting the sudden change in tone. Newspapers that had been critical of Parliament for years suddenly praised them, cautiously, for finally doing something right, though the praise was always backhanded. Congratulations to Parliament for addressing a crisis they ignored for decades, and better late than never, though perhaps a few thousand fewer deaths would have been preferable. The bill included several key provisions. First, it authorised the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow money at favourable rates backed by government guarantees. This was crucial. Private lenders were nervous about funding such an ambitious project, but with government backing, the money flowed. Second, it gave Bazalgette broad authority to begin construction immediately, cutting through much of the usual red tape that would have delayed groundbreaking for months. Third, it protected the project from future budget cuts. Once started, the sewer construction couldn't be defunded by a later parliament changing its mind. So that last provision was particularly important. Bazalgette knew that public attention was fickle. Right now, everyone wanted sewers built immediately. But what about next year, when the smell faded and bills came due? What if a new parliament decided the project was too expensive after all? By locking in funding and authority, the bill ensured that once construction began, it would continue to completion regardless of political winds. There was also a surprising amount of unity across party lines. Conservatives and liberals, usually at each other's throats, voted together. The sewage crisis had become one of those rare issues where partisanship seemed petty. Everyone suffered from the smell. Everyone benefited from fixing it. It was almost refreshing to see politicians agree on something, even if it took a public health disaster to make it happen. The bill passed the House of Commons first, then moved to the House of Lords, where it could have been delayed further. But the Lords, many of whom owned property in London, and you're suffering just as much as everyone else, expedited it. Normally, the upper chamber relished slowing down legislation from the Commons, asserting their authority, but not this time. They debated for a single day, voted, and sent it forward. Done. On August 2nd, 1858, the bill received royal assent, making it law. Queen Victoria signed off and construction could begin. From introduction to royal approval, 18 days. It was a legislative miracle. Of course, passing a law is one thing, actually building sewers is another. Here, but the speed of the legislation sent a clear message. This was a priority. Bazalgette had his funding, his authority, and his moment. Now he just had to deliver. The Great Stink Bill became a case study in how crises can break political gridlock. For years, nothing had been possible. Too expensive, too complicated, too many competing interests. But when the crisis became personal, when politicians themselves suffered, suddenly everything became possible. It's a cynical lesson, perhaps, but an important one. Change often requires making the powerful uncomfortable. And so, in the summer of 1858, British Parliament did something that still surprises historians. They acted quickly, decisively, and effectively. They funded infrastructure, they empowered an engineer. And they set in motion a project that would transform London and save countless lives. Not because they'd suddenly become enlightened or compassionate, but because they personally couldn't stand the smell anymore. Progress takes many forms. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in handkerchiefs soaked in cologne, passed by MPs desperate to breathe. Bazalgette's sewer system wasn't just a construction project, it was a feat of Victorian ambition and engineering brilliance. Teams of labourers, known as navvies, dug tunnels deep beneath London streets, working in cramped, dark and dangerous conditions. They carved through clay, rock, and centuries of forgotten history, sometimes uncovering ancient Roman ruins or medieval plague pits. The sewers were built using 318 million bricks and thousands of tons of concrete. They stretched over 1,100 miles when complete, creating an underground network that could handle millions of gallons of waste daily. Massive pumping stations designed to look like cathedrals lifted sewage upward when gravity wasn't enough. Bazalgette didn't just build sewers, he built monuments to sanitation. And because he was a genius, he built them larger than necessary, just in case London's population kept growing. Spoiler, it did, and his sewers still work today. Construction began almost immediately after the legislation passed. Bazalgette had been planning for years, so he didn't need months of preparation. He already knew where the sewers would run, how deep they needed to be, and what materials would work best. Within weeks of receiving authorization, crews were breaking ground across London. The scale of the project was staggering. Bazalgette's design called for 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, massive brick tunnels, some large enough to fit a horse-drawn carriage. These would be supplemented by over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers, all feeding into the main system. Altogether, it was one of the largest construction projects ever attempted, employing thousands of workers at its peak. The labourers, called navvies, were the backbone of the project. These were tough, skilled workers who'd built Britain's railways and canals. They worked with picks, shovels and wheelbarrows. No modern machinery, just muscle and determination. They dug through London's clay soil, which was both a blessing and a curse. Clay held its shape well, meaning tunnels were less likely to collapse, but it was also heavy, sticky, and exhausting to move. Working conditions were brutal. Tunnels were cramped, dark and poorly ventilated. Men worked by candlelight or primitive oil lamps, breathing stale air thick with dust. Cave-ins were a constant danger. So were floods. Hit an underground spring or buried stream, and suddenly your tunnel was filling with water faster than you could pump it out. Men drowned in the darkness, their bodies sometimes not recovered for days. Disease was rampant too. Workers were literally digging through centuries of London's waste. They encountered old cesspits, forgotten burial grounds and contaminated soil. Infections were common. Cholera still lurked in the groundwater. And there were no antibiotics, no tetanus shots, no safety regulations. If you got sick, you either recovered on your own or you died. Many died. Bazalgette tried to protect his workers where possible. He insisted on proper shoring in tunnels to prevent collapses. He organised medical care, bringing doctors to construction sites rather than expecting injured men to travel. And he paid relatively well. Not generously, but better than many employers at the time. Still, it was dangerous work and men accepted the risks because they needed the jobs. The engineering challenges were enormous. London's streets were already crowded with gas pipes, water mains and underground railways. Bazalgette had to navigate around all of these, sometimes tunnelling deeper than planned to avoid existing infrastructure. He also had to maintain precise gradients. Sewers rely on gravity, so the slope had to be exactly right. Too steep and water would rush through too fast, leaving solid waste behind. Too shallow and everything would clog. The sewers were built using millions of bricks, all laid by hand. Bricklayers worked in the tunnels, constructing arched ceilings and smooth walls designed to keep waste flowing. The quality of construction was exceptional. These weren't rough utility tunnels. They were precisely engineered structures meant to last centuries. And they have. At certain points, Bazalgette built pumping stations, massive buildings housing steam-powered pumps that could lift sewage upward when gravity alone wasn't enough. These stations were architectural marvels. Instead of hiding them, Bazalgette designed them to look like churches or cathedrals, with ornate facades, decorative towers, and beautiful ironwork. Why? because he believed infrastructure should be beautiful. Even sewage pumping stations could be sources of civic pride. The pumping stations were powered by enormous steam engines, some of the largest ever built. These engines ran continuously, never stopping, lifting millions of gallons of waste over hills and obstacles. Engineers staffed them around the clock, monitoring pressure, adjusting valves, and keeping everything running smoothly. It was industrial age technology at its finest, powerful, reliable, and surprisingly elegant. As construction progressed, Londoners watched with a mixture of fascination and frustration. Streets were torn up constantly. Traffic was disrupted. Noise and dust filled neighbourhoods, but people endured it because they understood what was being built. This wasn't some politician's vanity project. It was salvation. The sewers would end cholera, clean the Thames, and make London livable again. Bazalgette also built the embankments, the Victoria, Albert and Chelsea embankments that still line the Thames today. These weren't just decorative, they served multiple functions. Underground, they housed the main intercepting sewers. At street level, they created wide, tree-lined promenades perfect for walking, and by narrowing the river, they sped up its flow, helping flush remaining pollution downstream. The embankments reclaimed land from the river, turning mudflats into valuable real estate. They also provided space for underground railways and utility lines. It was brilliant urban planning, solving multiple problems with a single structure, and it was beautiful. The embankments transformed London's riverfront from a stinking wasteland into one of the city's most attractive features. Construction took years. The main system wasn't completed until 1865, though sections opened earlier as they were finished. Even then, Bazalgette continued refining and expanding the network into the 1870s. It was his life's work, and he oversaw every detail personally. He inspected tunnels, checked calculations, and demanded perfection from his contractors. Workers complained about his exacting standards, but they also respected him. He wasn't asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Bazalgette regularly descended into the tunnels, crawling through tight spaces and wading through sewage to inspect his work. When finally complete, London's sewer system was recognised as one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian age. It was functional, beautiful, and built to last. Over 150 years later, much of Bazalgette's original system is still in use, still carrying waste, still protecting London. It's a testament to his genius, his persistence, and his refusal to build anything less than perfect. He didn't just save London, he showed the world what modern infrastructure could accomplish. Part of Bazalgette's plan involved constructing the Thames embankment. Wide, elegant riverside walkways that served multiple purposes. On the surface, they were beautiful. Tree-lined promenades where Londoners could stroll and enjoy the river. Underneath, hidden from view, ran the massive sewer pipes that carried waste safely away from the city centre. The embankments also reclaimed land from the river, creating valuable real estate while narrowing the Thames and speeding its flow. It was brilliant urban planning, solve a sanitation crisis, improve public space, and make the city more beautiful all at once. The Victoria Embankment, Chelsea Embankment, and Albert Embankment transformed London's riverfront from a stinking nightmare into a symbol of Victorian progress. Tourists today walk along them with no idea that just beneath their feet runs one of the greatest sanitation systems ever built. The embankments were Bazalgette's masterstroke, infrastructure disguised as civic beauty. Before their construction, the Thames's banks were irregular, muddy, and frankly disgusting. At low tide, vast stretches of foul-smelling mud were exposed, covered in waste and debris. There were no pleasant walkways, no attractive views, nothing that made you want to spend time near the river. The waterfront was industrial, chaotic, and best avoided. Bazalgette proposed changing all of that. Instead of simply burying sewers under existing streets, he would build entirely new structures along the river's edge. These embankments would push the river's boundary back, reclaiming land from the Thames. The reclaimed land would sit atop a foundation of rubble and earth, and buried within that foundation would be the main sewer lines, massive brick tunnels carrying waste eastward. Above ground, the embankments would be transformed into public promenades, wide granite-lined walkways planted with trees decorated with benches and lampposts. Londoners could walk along the river, enjoy the view, and have no idea that tons of sewage were flowing just beneath their feet. It was infrastructure as art, functional and beautiful simultaneously. The construction was complex. First, wooden cofferdams were built in the river, temporary walls that held back water, creating dry work areas. Inside these cofferdams, workers dug foundations, laid brick sewers, and built the structural supports for the embankments. Once the sewers were in place, the cofferdams were filled with earth and rubble, gradually extending the riverbank outward. Finally, the surface was paved, trees were planted, and the elegant walkways emerged. The Victoria Embankment, opened in 1870, was the first and most famous. It stretched from Westminster to Blackfriars, running along the north bank of the Thames. At the time, it was revolutionary, a public space designed for pleasure rather than commerce, accessible to everyone regardless of class. Londoners flocked to it, delighted by the novelty of a clean, attractive riverside walk. Beneath the Victoria Embankment ran not just sewers but also the new District Line Underground Railway and a network of gas and water pipes. Bazalgette had designed the structure to accommodate all of these utilities, creating an underground corridor that kept London's infrastructure organised and accessible. If a pipe needed repair or a sewer needed maintenance, workers could access everything without tearing up the entire street. It was urban planning at its finest. The embankments also served a hydraulic purpose. By narrowing the Thames, they increased the speed of the river's current. Faster-moving water carried pollution downstream more efficiently and reduced the build-up of sediment and waste. It was a subtle but important improvement. The Thames would still receive some pollution, but it would flush through faster, now reducing the concentration and smell. The Chelsea Embankment, completed in 1874, and the Albert Embankment on the South Bank, opened in 1869, followed similar designs. Each was beautiful in its own right, with gardens, statues, and carefully designed vistas. Together, they transformed over 3 miles of riverfront from industrial wasteland into elegant public space. Property values along the embankment skyrocketed. Suddenly, living near the Thames was desirable again. Wealthy Londoners built townhouses overlooking the river. Hotels and restaurants opened along the promenades. The embankments didn't just hide sewers, they created some of London's most valuable real estate. But the embankments weren't without controversy. Displacing the river meant destroying existing structures, wharves, docks, and slums that had clung to the riverbank for centuries. Property owners fought back, demanding compensation. Residents were evicted, their homes demolished to make way for progress. As always, the poor bore the brunt of disruption, forced to relocate while wealthier neighbourhoods benefited from the improvements. Still, the transformation was undeniable. Where once there had been mud, stench, and squalor, there were now trees, benches, and clean air. The embankments became symbols of Victorian achievement, proof that engineering and civic ambition could reshape cities for the better. They appeared in paintings, postcards, and guidebooks as examples of London's modernity. Today, the embankments remain among London's most beloved features. Tourists walk them daily, office workers eat lunch on their benches, and joggers run along their paths. Most have no idea they're walking atop a Victorian sewer system, which is exactly as Bazalgette intended. The best infrastructure is invisible. It works so well, we forget it's even there. The embankments prove that sanitation and beauty weren't mutually exclusive. Cities didn't have to choose between functional infrastructure and attractive public spaces. With clever design and enough ambition, they could have both. It was a lesson many cities around the world would eventually learn, often by studying London's example. Joseph Bazalgette understood something many engineers miss. Infrastructure is about more than just function. It shapes how people experience their city, how they feel about their government, and what they believe is possible. The embankments weren't just sewers, they were a statement. London had confronted its greatest crisis and emerged stronger, cleaner, and more beautiful than before, and every time someone walked along the Thames and enjoyed the view, they were standing on the proof. Once Bazalgette's sewers were operational, and clean water supplies were separated from waste, something remarkable happened. Cholera disappeared. The disease that had terrorized London for decades simply stopped. The final major outbreak occurred in 1866, and even that was limited to areas not yet connected to the new sewer system. Once those neighbourhoods were hooked up, cholera vanished from London entirely. It was proof, undeniable, life-saving proof, that John Snow had been right. Cholera wasn't caused by bad air, it was caused by contaminated water. The Great Stink had forced London to confront its sanitation crisis, and in doing so, the city had accidentally defeated one of history's deadliest diseases. Thousands of lives were saved, not by medicine, but by engineering. Bazalgette's sewers didn't just stop the stench, they stopped a killer. Let's put this in perspective. Cholera had killed tens of thousands of Londoners in the decades before the sewers were built. The 1832 outbreak killed over 6,000. The 1849 outbreak killed 14,000. The 1854 outbreak killed another 10,000. Each time, the disease struck seemingly at random, devastating families and neighbourhoods. Doctors were helpless. Medicine offered no cure. Survival was mostly luck. But after the sewers were completed and water supplies were separated from waste, cholera outbreaks stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The disease that had haunted London for a generation simply ceased to be a threat. It was one of the greatest public health victories in human history, achieved not through vaccines or drugs, but through infrastructure. The 1866 outbreak was the final test. Cholera appeared in the East End, in neighbourhoods not yet fully connected to Bazalgette's system. The old cesspits and contaminated wells were still in use, and cholera found them. Over 5,000 people died in that outbreak, a tragedy but far smaller than previous epidemics. And here's the crucial part. The disease didn't spread beyond those disconnected neighbourhoods. Areas with proper sewers and clean water remained untouched. It was a controlled experiment, unintentional but definitive. Then public health officials investigated and found the pattern clear. Cholera only struck where water was contaminated. Where sewers worked and water was clean, cholera couldn't gain a foothold. It was the smoking gun that finally, conclusively proved Jon Snow's waterborne theory. Miasma theory collapsed under the weight of evidence. Bad air didn't cause cholera, bad water did. And fixing the water fixed the problem. The implications were enormous. If cholera could be defeated by sanitation, what about other diseases? Typhoid, dysentery, and countless other illnesses were also waterborne. Proper sewers and clean water could save lives on a massive scale. London had accidentally stumbled onto a public health revolution. Other cities took notice. Municipal governments across Britain and around the world studied London's sewers and began planning their own systems. Engineers travelled to London to learn from Bazalgette. His designs were copied, adapted, and implemented in cities from Manchester to Melbourne. The Victorian sewer system became a model, proof that engineering could solve social problems. In London itself, the impact was immediate and measurable. Death rates dropped, life expectancy increased. Neighbourhoods that had been death traps became livable. Parents no longer lived in constant fear that their children would contract cholera. The psychological relief was almost as important as the physical health benefits. Londoners could finally breathe easy, literally and figuratively. There was a certain irony in all of this. For decades, doctors had insisted cholera was caused by bad air. They'd focused on eliminating smells, improving ventilation, and purifying the atmosphere. None of it worked. Then engineers came along, focused on moving waste efficiently, and accidentally cured the disease. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes the solution comes from an unexpected direction. Water companies also had to adapt. Before the sewers, they'd drawn water directly from the Thames, done minimal filtering and sent it to homes. That was no longer acceptable. New regulations required filtration, separation of water intake from sewer outflows, and regular quality testing. It wasn't enough to just build sewers, the entire water system needed to be rethought. The transformation took time, even after the main sewers were complete. It took years to connect every household, eliminate every cesspit, and ensure every neighbourhood had access to clean water. But gradually the pieces came together, and as they did, London became healthier, cleaner, and safer than it had been in generations. Cholera never completely disappeared from the world. It still exists in places with poor sanitation. But in London, in cities that learned from London's example, it became a relic of the past. A disease that once killed thousands was reduced to a historical footnote, defeated not by brilliant doctors but by patient engineers who understood that health starts with clean water and proper waste management. Bazalgette probably never set out to cure cholera. He just wanted to build sewers that worked, but in doing so, he saved more lives than any doctor of his era. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest medical breakthroughs don't happen in hospitals or laboratories. Sometimes they happen underground, in brick tunnels that carry away the waste, leaving behind a city where children can drink from the tap without dying. That's not just engineering, that's a miracle. The Great Stink and the subsequent construction of London's sewer system marked a turning point in public health. For the first time, authorities acknowledged that infrastructure wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. Clean water, proper sanitation, and waste management became priorities. Other cities around the world watched London's transformation, and began building their own sewer systems. The idea that governments had a responsibility to protect public health through infrastructure became standard. But the lesson came at a cost. Tens of thousands had died in cholera outbreaks that could have been prevented if leaders had acted sooner. The Great Stink was a wake-up call, but it was also a reminder. Progress often only happens when the powerful are forced to suffer alongside everyone else. Before the Great Stink, public health was mostly an individual responsibility. If you got sick, that was your problem. If your neighbourhood had contaminated water, move somewhere else. Governments provided minimal services, perhaps some street cleaning, maybe a rudimentary water supply, but the idea that the state had an obligation to keep citizens healthy was still radical. The Great Stink changed that calculus. It demonstrated that public health crises don't respect property lines or class boundaries. Contaminated water and epidemic disease affect everyone, rich and poor alike, and more importantly, it showed that these problems require collective solutions. No individual could fix the Thames, no single household could build sewers. It required government action, public funding, and coordinated infrastructure. This was the birth of modern public health infrastructure. After London's sewers proved successful, the concept spread rapidly. Cities across Britain began planning their own sewer systems. Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool all studied Bazalgette's designs and adapted them to their local needs. Municipal governments hired engineers, floated bonds, and began the expensive, disruptive work of building underground waste systems. The movement spread internationally too. In the United States, and as cities like New York and Chicago were facing similar sanitation crises, they sent delegations to London to study the sewers, brought back reports and blueprints, and began construction. European cities followed suit. Even colonial administrators in places like India and Australia began building sewer systems, recognizing that European-style cities required European-style infrastructure. But here's the bitter truth. It shouldn't have required a crisis. The Great Stink was preventable. Engineers had been warning about London's sewage problem for decades. John Snow had proven cholera was waterborne in 1854, 4 years before the Great Stink. The knowledge existed. The solutions were available. What was missing was political will and public demand for action. Tens of thousands of people died unnecessarily because governments procrastinated. Poor families lost children to cholera that clean water could have prevented. Workers died of diseases contracted from contaminated wells. All of this was avoidable, but it required spending money, disrupting commerce, and admitting that the existing system had failed. The Great Stink forced that admission. When MPs couldn't work, when newspapers mocked Parliament daily, when the smell became a national embarrassment, suddenly action became possible. But by then the death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that cholera alone killed over 40,000 Londoners between 1830 and 1866. Most of those deaths occurred in the decades when solutions existed but weren't implemented. This pattern, the crisis-forcing action after years of denial, became depressingly familiar in public health history. Time and again, societies wait until disaster strikes before investing in prevention. It's the same story with fire safety regulations, food safety laws, workplace protections. Someone has to die, often many someones, before politicians feel enough pressure to act. The Great Stink also highlighted class inequalities in public health. The wealthy had always suffered less from sanitation problems. They lived in better neighbourhoods, could afford clean water delivery, and had resources to flee during epidemics. The poor had no such options. They lived in the worst areas, drank from contaminated pumps and died in disproportionate numbers. Even after the sewers were built, the benefits flowed unevenly. Wealthy neighbourhoods got connected first. New poor neighbourhoods waited years for sewer access. And in some cases, landlords charged tenants extra fees to connect to the new system, profiting from public infrastructure. The class divide didn't disappear, it just took new forms. Still, the Great Stink did establish an important precedent. Governments have a duty to provide basic public health infrastructure. Clean water and proper sanitation became recognised as public goods, things that markets alone wouldn't provide adequately. It justified taxation to fund infrastructure and government regulation of private utilities. This was a significant philosophical shift. Victorian Britain was deeply committed to laissez-faire economics and minimal government intervention. But public health forced a reckoning. Some problems were too big, too complex, again too important to leave to individual initiative or market forces. Infrastructure required planning, coordination, and public investment. The Great Stink proved it. The lessons extended beyond sewers. If government should provide sanitation, what about healthcare, education, housing? The Great Stink opened debates that would shape British politics for generations. It didn't resolve those debates. We're still arguing about the proper role of government in public welfare. But it shifted the starting point, establishing that at minimum, the state has a responsibility to prevent mass death from preventable diseases. Looking back, the Great Stink was both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because it led to infrastructure that saved countless lives. A tragedy because it should never have been necessary. The deaths that prompted action could have been prevented with earlier investment. It's a lesson that remains relevant today. Infrastructure isn't glamorous. Preventative measures don't make headlines, but they save lives. And waiting until crisis forces action means accepting unnecessary death as the price of procrastination. London learned that lesson the hard way in the summer of 1858, when the Thames finally made the cost of inaction impossible to ignore. The Great Stink affected everyone, but not equally. Wealthy Londoners could retreat to country estates, or seal their windows with lime-soaked curtains. The poor had no such options. They lived in cramped, poorly ventilated slums right next to the most polluted sections of the Thames. They drank contaminated water because they had no choice. They worked along the river because that's where the jobs were, and when cholera struck it hit the poor hardest. The Great Stink laid bare the brutal realities of Victorian inequality. While MPS debated in Parliament, working-class families were dying in tenements. The sewers that eventually saved London were funded by taxes and built by labourers, but the benefits flowed first to the wealthy neighbourhoods. Still, even incremental progress mattered. Once the sewers reached the slums, lives were saved. Slowly, painfully, London learned that public health couldn't be divided by class. Disease didn't care about your address. Let's be very clear. The Great Stink was a universal experience, but its impacts were deeply unequal. Wealth determined whether you merely endured an unpleasant summer or whether you faced genuine health crises and potential death. For the wealthy, the Great Stink was primarily an inconvenience. Yes, it was disgusting. Yes, it disrupted Parliament and made life unpleasant. But wealthy Londoners had options. They owned country estates outside the city, where the air was clean and the nearest river wasn't a sewer. When the smell became unbearable, They simply packed up households and left. Some spent the entire summer away, returning only when autumn arrived and temperatures and smells dropped. Those who stayed could afford mitigation measures. They installed thick curtains treated with chloride of lime to filter the air. They bought expensive perfumes and incense to mask the smell. They had servants handle outdoor tasks, minimizing their own exposure. And they lived in neighbourhoods built on higher ground, away from the river's worst stretches. Geography was privilege. The further from the Thames, the more expensive the property and the less severe the smell. Compare that to the working class. Most poor Londoners lived in the East End or Southwark, low-lying areas close to the river where housing was cheap precisely because conditions were terrible. These neighbourhoods had been dealing with sanitation crises for decades. The Great Stink wasn't new, it was just worse. And unlike the wealthy, the poor had nowhere to go. No country estates, no ability to relocate even temporarily. They just endured. Their homes had no elaborate curtains or ventilation systems. Windows were few and small. Closing them meant suffocating heat. Opening them meant breathing stench. Either way you suffered, and many poor families didn't even have separate rooms, meaning entire households ate, slept and lived in single chambers, where the smell permeated everything: clothing, bedding, food. Water access was another brutal divide. Wealthy neighbourhoods had piped water delivered directly to homes. This water was drawn from upstream sections of the Thames, before most of the city's sewage entered the river. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was safer than what the poor drank. Working-class neighbourhoods relied on public pumps drawing water from wells or downstream sections of the Thames. This water was horrifically contaminated, filled with bacteria, sewage and industrial waste. People knew it was dangerous, but what choice did they have? You can't survive without water. Smear families drank, cooked with and washed in water that was literally killing them. When cholera struck, the pattern was always the same. It devastated poor neighbourhoods while barely touching wealthy ones. The rich might lose a few servants or isolated family members. The poor lost entire streets. Families would watch neighbours die, knowing they might be next, helpless to do anything about it because the water pump was the only water source they had. Employment patterns reinforced these inequalities. Working-class jobs were concentrated near the river: docks, warehouses, factories, tanneries. These were the most polluted areas, where the stench was strongest and the health risks highest. But poor Londoners couldn't afford to be choosy about employment. If the job was on the riverbank, you took it and hoped you didn't get sick. Even after the sewers were built, the benefits reached the wealthy first. Bazalgette's plan prioritised central London and prosperous neighbourhoods. The East End and working-class districts waited years for full connections. Property owners in wealthy areas happily paid for sewer access. Landlords in poor neighbourhoods often refused, unwilling to invest in infrastructure for tenants who had no power to demand it. This created a tiered system. Some Londoners enjoyed the benefits of modern sanitation almost immediately, while others continued living with overflowing cesspits and contaminated water for years after the Great Stink had supposedly been solved. It was infrastructure apartheid, reflecting and reinforcing the class divisions that defined Victorian society. Politically, this dynamic shaped responses to the crisis. When the wealthy suffered, Parliament acted quickly, hence the rapid passage of the sewer legislation. But the poor had been suffering for decades without prompting similar urgency. Their deaths from cholera were treated as regrettable but inevitable. collateral damage of urban life. Only when MPs couldn't work did sanitation become an emergency. Still, there's a complicated truth here. Even unequal progress is progress. Once the sewers were eventually extended to working-class neighbourhoods, lives were saved. Children who would have died of cholera survived. Families gained access to cleaner water. Life expectancy in poor neighbourhoods increased dramatically. The infrastructure was built for the benefit of the wealthy first, but ultimately it helped everyone. The Great Stink exposed Victorian London's class divide in sharp relief. It showed how wealth determined not just comfort but survival, how public health crises hit the vulnerable hardest, and how political will materialised only when elites personally suffered. It was an ugly lesson, but an important one. A healthy society requires infrastructure that reaches everyone, not just those who can afford it. Disease doesn't respect class boundaries, and neither should public health policy. Victorian newspapers loved a scandal, and the Great Stink was scandal gold. Journalists descended on the Thames, documenting the horror in vivid, often darkly comic detail. Political cartoons depicted MPs fleeing Parliament, holding handkerchiefs to their noses. Editorials demanded action, ridiculed delays, and shamed politicians who'd ignored the crisis for years. Thus, the satirical magazine Punch ran cartoons showing Father Thames as a diseased, rotting figure. The press didn't just report the Great Stink, they amplified it, turned it into a national embarrassment, and made it politically impossible to ignore. Public outcry grew. Petitions were signed, meetings were held, and slowly the pressure mounted until Parliament had no choice but to act. The Great Stink proved that a free press and an angry public could force even the most reluctant government to do the right thing eventually. The British press in 1858 was vibrant, competitive, and merciless. Newspapers competed for readers by being clever, outrageous, and unafraid to mock the powerful. They had editorial independence, no government censorship, no pressure to toe official lines. And when the Great Stink arrived, they seized on it with glee. The Times, Britain's most influential newspaper, published daily updates on the smell. They didn't just report facts, they editorialised furiously, calling the situation a disgrace to civilization and demanding immediate government action. They printed letters from readers describing their experiences, businessmen who couldn't work near the river, mothers worried about their children's health, workers suffering respiratory problems. Other papers joined in. The Morning Chronicle ran investigative pieces tracing the history of London's sanitation failures, pointing out how many times engineers had warned about impending crisis. The Daily Telegraph interviewed watermen and dock workers, giving voice to working-class people directly affected. These weren't abstract policy debates. They were human stories that made the crisis personal and urgent. But it was the satirical press that really sharpened the attack. Punch, a weekly magazine famous for its biting humour and political cartoons, dedicated multiple issues to the Great Stink. One famous cartoon showed Father Thames introducing his children, diphtheria, scrofula and cholera, to the City of London. Father Thames was depicted as a filthy, diseased figure, dripping with sewage, representing how the river had transformed from a source of life to a source of death. Another cartoon showed MPs fleeing Parliament on a specially constructed pontoon boat, desperate to escape the smell. The caption read, "The Exodus of the Legislature." It was funny, but it also made a serious point. The people in charge were willing to abandon their duties rather than fix the problem that caused their discomfort. Political cartoons were powerful in the Victorian era, maybe even more so than today. Many people couldn't read complex news articles, but anyone could understand a cartoon. They spread rapidly, were reprinted in multiple papers, and shaped public opinion powerfully. The image of incompetent politicians fleeing from a problem they'd created resonated with readers across class lines. The press also highlighted hypocrisy. They dug up old parliamentary debates where MPs had dismissed sewer proposals as too expensive. They printed quotes from politicians who'd claimed London's sanitation was adequate. Then they juxtaposed those statements with descriptions of the current crisis. The message was clear. You were warned, you ignored it, and now we're all suffering because of your negligence. Public letters sections became forums for outrage. Citizens wrote in describing their experiences, demanding action and shaming representatives. Some letters were eloquent and reasoned. Others were angry and accusatory, but all contributed to a sense that the public had lost patience with government inaction. The press also covered the public meetings that sprang up across London. Citizens gathered in churches, town halls and public squares to discuss the crisis and organise petitions. Newspapers reported these meetings extensively, printing speeches, listing attendees, and amplifying calls for reform. It created a feedback loop. Press coverage encouraged more people to get involved, which generated more coverage, which increased pressure on politicians. Petitions flooded Parliament. Some had thousands of signatures, demanding immediate construction of proper sewers. The press made sure MPs knew these petitions existed, running front-page stories about public demands action, or citizens plead for relief. Politicians who ignored these petitions did so knowing their inaction was being publicly documented. The pressure became unbearable. MPs couldn't open a newspaper without seeing themselves mocked. They couldn't attend social events without being asked why nothing was being done. Their constituents bombarded them with angry letters. The Great Stink dominated public conversation for weeks, and the press made sure it stayed at the top of the agenda. This was early mass media functioning as it should, holding power accountable, amplifying public voices, and making it politically costly to ignore serious problems. Without the press, it's quite possible Parliament would have delayed longer, formed another committee, or found some way to avoid expensive infrastructure spending. But the combination of daily news coverage, satirical mockery, and genuine public anger created a situation where inaction was no longer tenable. When Parliament finally passed the sewer legislation, newspapers took partial credit, and they weren't entirely wrong. The Times editorial celebrating the bill's passage noted, "It is satisfying to observe that public pressure, maintained by a vigilant press, can move even the most sluggish governmental body." The Great Stink showed that democratic accountability requires more than just elections. It requires an informed, engaged public and a press willing to challenge power. Newspapers gave citizens information, amplified their voices, and made sure politicians couldn't hide from the consequences of their decisions. It wasn't perfect then or now, but it worked. And London got its sewers partly because journalists decided that a stinking river made good copy, and they weren't going to let anyone forget it. Even after Bazalgette sewers were built, London's relationship with the Thames remained complicated. The sewers carried waste downstream, past the city, but not far enough. At low tide, especially in summer, the smell would return, wafting back upriver from the outflow points. Coastal towns downstream complained. Fishermen sued, and occasionally, when the system was overwhelmed by heavy rains, untreated sewage still overflowed directly into the river. The Great Stink was solved, but not eliminated. It took decades more refinement, additional treatment plants, and constant upgrades to fully modernise London's sewage system. The lesson was clear. Infrastructure is never done. Cities are living organisms, constantly growing and evolving, and the systems that keep them functioning require endless maintenance, investment, and care. The Great Stink ended, but vigilance couldn't. Bazalgette's sewers were brilliant, but they weren't perfect. The original system transported waste downstream and released it into the Thames near Barking and Crossness, miles east of central London. At high tide, the waste was carried out to the Thames estuary and eventually into the North Sea. Problem solved, right? Not exactly. At low tide, things got messy. The outflow points would discharge raw sewage onto the exposed mudflats. As the tide receded, waste piled up festering in the sun, and when the tide turned, water flowed back upriver, bringing that smell with it. On hot summer days with low tides, the stench would drift back toward London, a faint but unmistakable reminder of what was flowing in the river. It wasn't as bad as the Great Stink, nothing was ever that bad again, but was noticeable enough that residents complained. Newspapers ran occasional stories about the return of the smell or Thames still troubles East London. MPs who thought they'd solved the problem once and for all were frustrated to discover that infrastructure is never truly finished. Downstream communities were furious. Towns like Erith and Gravesend, which sat near the outflow points, found their riverbanks covered in sewage at low tide. Fishermen complained that the pollution was destroying fish populations in the estuary. Property values in riverside areas dropped. Local governments sued the Metropolitan Board of Works, demanding compensation or changes to the system. Bazalgette responded by building treatment facilities at Barking and Crossness. These weren't advanced by modern standards, basically settling tanks where solid waste could separate from liquid before being released into the river, but they helped. The solids were collected and eventually used as fertilizer, sold to farmers, turning waste into a revenue stream. The remaining liquid, now somewhat cleaner, was released into the Thames at more strategic times, high tide, when current would carry out to sea faster. Still, the system had limits. London's population kept growing, this meaning more sewage constantly entering the system. And the sewers, though built larger than necessary, eventually reached capacity. During heavy rainstorms, the combined sewer system, which carried both sewage and stormwater, would overflow. Emergency relief points would open, dumping untreated waste directly into the Thames to prevent the tunnels from backing up and flooding the streets. These overflows were infrequent, but they happened, and every time they did, it reinforced the lesson that infrastructure requires constant attention. You can't build once and forget about it. Cities change, populations grow, technology improves. What was cutting edge in 1865 became merely adequate by 1900 and outdated by 1950. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, London continued upgrading its sewer system. New tunnels were added, treatment plants were expanded and modernised. Separate storm sewers were gradually built to keep rainwater out of the waste system. Each generation of engineers inherited Bazalgette's work and improved upon it, adapting to new challenges. One persistent problem was public perception. After the sewers were built and cholera disappeared, many Londoners assumed the problem was permanently solved. They stopped thinking about sewage, stopped demanding infrastructure investment, and started taking clean water for granted. This made it harder to secure funding for maintenance and upgrades. Politicians facing tight budgets would cut infrastructure spending first, assuming sewers could be neglected for a few years without consequence. But infrastructure doesn't work that way. Neglecting maintenance leads to failures. Pipes crack, pumps break, and systems that once functioned smoothly start experiencing problems. By the early 20th century, sections of Bazalgette's original sewers were showing their age. Bricks crumbled, mortar deteriorated. Repairs became increasingly frequent and expensive. London learned, again, that infrastructure isn't a one-time expense. It's an ongoing commitment. Every generation must invest in maintaining and improving the systems they inherit. Otherwise, they risk falling back into crisis, repeating the mistakes of their predecessors. The Thames itself took decades to recover. Even with sewers carrying most waste away, the river remained polluted for years. Industrial waste, combined sewer overflows, and accumulated sediment kept water quality poor. It wasn't until stricter environmental regulations in the late 20th century, combined with improved treatment technology, that the Thames truly began to heal. Today, the Thames is cleaner than it has been in centuries. Fish have returned. Otters live along its banks. People swim in it for charity events. It's a remarkable recovery. Proof that even severely damaged ecosystems can heal if given time and proper care. But it took over a century of continuous effort, investment, and vigilance. The Great Stink ended in 1858, but the work it initiated never really stopped. London has been maintaining, upgrading, and expanding its sewer system continuously ever since. New tunnels are still being built today, massive super sewers designed to handle the city's current population and prevent overflow events during storms. Bazalgette's original system forms the core, but it's been supplemented by generations of additional infrastructure. The lesson? Infrastructure is never finished. It's a continuous process, requiring each generation to invest in the systems that sustain their city. The Great Stink forced London to build sewers, but keeping those sewers functional, adapting them to changing needs, and preventing future crises requires eternal vigilance. It's less dramatic than the original construction, less celebrated, and far less interesting. But it's just as important. Because the only thing worse than not having infrastructure is having infrastructure that fails, because no one bothered to maintain it. The Great Stink didn't just inspire sewers, it sparked a wave of Victorian innovation. Suddenly, sanitation was trendy, and patents were filed for improved water closets, better ventilation systems, and odour-reducing chemicals. Public bathhouses were built. Street cleaning became more systematic. Even architecture changed. New buildings incorporated better plumbing, ventilation shafts, and waste disposal systems. The Victorians, once content to live in filth, became obsessed with cleanliness, or at least the appearance of it. Soap became affordable and widely available. Advertisements promoted hygiene as a moral virtue. And while not everyone had access to these improvements, the cultural shift was real. The Great Stink had made filth unacceptable. Progress, however slow, was finally fashionable. Before the Great Stink, sanitation was boring. Nobody talked about it at dinner parties. Nobody bragged about their plumbing. It was unglamorous, unpleasant, and best left undiscussed. But after 1858, when the smell had literally stopped government from functioning, sanitation became socially acceptable, even fashionable. Suddenly having a modern water closet wasn't just convenient, it was a status symbol. Manufacturers rushed to capitalize on this shift. Patent offices were flooded with applications for improved toilet designs. Inventors tinkered with flush mechanisms, seal systems, and bowl shapes, each claiming their version was more hygienic, more efficient, and more modern than the competition. Some innovations were genuinely useful. Better traps that prevented sewer gases from entering homes, for example. Others were absurd. Decorative toilet seats with built-in music boxes, because apparently Victorians wanted their bathroom experience accompanied by tinkling melodies. Ventilation became a major focus. Engineers designed elaborate systems of shafts, vents, and air channels meant to keep fresh air circulating and foul air expelled. New buildings incorporated ventilation into their design from the start. Older buildings were retrofitted with vents cut through walls and ceilings. Some of these systems worked brilliantly. Others just created drafty houses where wind whistled through poorly sealed channels, bringing cold air in winter, but at least, theoretically, keeping diseases out. Public bathhouses proliferated across London. These weren't luxury spas, they were utilitarian facilities where working-class people could pay a few pennies for a hot bath. Many homes still lacked indoor plumbing, making personal hygiene difficult. Bathhouses filled that gap, yet offering not just cleanliness but also a social space where neighbours gathered, exchanged gossip, and occasionally got into arguments about who was taking too long in the tub. The bathhouse movement was partly philanthropic. Reformers genuinely believed clean bodies would lead to moral improvement, and partly economic. Entrepreneurs saw profit in sanitation. They built bathhouses in working-class neighbourhoods, charged affordable rates, and made decent money while improving public health. It was capitalism and charity intertwined, very Victorian. Street cleaning improved dramatically. Before the Great Stink, streets were cleaned sporadically, if at all. Horse manure, food waste, and general debris accumulated until it either washed away in rain or was shoveled aside grudgingly. After 1858, municipal governments organised professional street cleaning departments. Sweepers worked regular routes. Waste was collected systematically rather than haphazardly. Streets became noticeably cleaner, which improved not just appearance but also public health by reducing breeding grounds for disease. Soap, once a luxury item, became widely available. Manufacturers like Lever Brothers and Pears launched major advertising campaigns promoting cleanliness. Their ads appealed to Victorian morality, suggesting that cleanliness wasn't just healthy, it was godly. Dirty people were portrayed as lazy, immoral, even dangerous. Clean people were industrious, respectable, and virtuous. It was social engineering through marketing, and it worked. Soap sales exploded. People who'd never used soap regularly began washing daily, or at least more frequently than before. Laundry became a regular chore rather than a rare event. Homes that could afford it installed sinks and basins specifically for washing. Cleanliness became associated with respectability, which meant the working class, eager to appear respectable, embraced hygiene practices previously reserved for the wealthy. Architecture evolved too. Victorian builders started incorporating better plumbing into new construction. Instead of adding toilets as afterthoughts, they designed homes with dedicated bathrooms from the start. Water pipes were run through walls systematically. Waste pipes were vented properly. Windows were positioned to maximize ventilation. the Victorians brought engineering thinking to domestic architecture, treating homes as systems that needed to function efficiently. Chemicals became part of household management. Chloride of lime, carbolic acid, and other disinfectants were marketed for home use. Housewives were instructed to scrub floors, disinfect surfaces, and eliminate odours systematically. Cleaning became ritualized, almost obsessive. Some of this was genuinely helpful. Disinfecting surfaces did reduce disease transmission. Some was just Victorian anxiety manifesting as compulsive scrubbing. Medical thinking shifted too. While germ theory hadn't fully replaced miasma theory yet, doctors began emphasizing cleanliness as disease prevention. They couldn't explain why washing helped, but they observed that it did. So they prescribed hygiene. Wash your hands, bathe regularly, keep your home clean. It wasn't scientifically rigorous, but it was pragmatically effective. Educational materials spread these ideas. Pamphlets, posters, and books instructed citizens in proper hygiene practices. Schools began teaching children to wash hands before eating. Churches preached that cleanliness was next to godliness, literally. The Great Stink had created a teachable moment, and Victorian society seized it, embedding sanitation into social norms. Not everyone benefited equally, of course. These innovations, soap, bathhouses, improved plumbing, cost money. The wealthy adopted them quickly. The poor accessed them slowly, if at all. A cultural shift toward valuing cleanliness doesn't automatically create the economic means to achieve it. But even incremental change mattered. Each household that gained access to soap, each neighbourhood that got a bathhouse, each street that was cleaned regularly. These small improvements accumulated into significant public health gains. The Great Stink proved that crises can catalyse innovation. When society collectively decides something is unacceptable, entrepreneurs, inventors, and reformers mobilise to address it. Sanitation went from ignored to prioritised, from boring to trendy, from afterthought to essential. And while the Victorian obsession with cleanliness sometimes bordered on absurd music box toilets, really, the overall trajectory was positive. London became cleaner, healthier, and more livable. Not perfect, not equal, but undeniably better. And all because one terrible summer made filth impossible to ignore. Before industrialisation, the Thames teemed with life. Salmon swam upstream. Birds nested along its banks. People actually swam in it, voluntarily. By 1858, the river was biologically dead. Nothing could survive in water that toxic. But once Bazalgette sewers diverted waste and water quality slowly improved, life began to return. Fish reappeared. Birds came back. By the late 20th century, salmon were spotted in the Thames for the first time in over a century. It was a slow, painful recovery, but it proved something important. Nature is resilient. Given a chance, even the most damaged ecosystems can heal. The Thames will never be pristine. It's still an urban river carrying the runoff of millions, but it's alive. And that's a legacy worth celebrating. Let's start with what was lost. The Thames of the 18th century was a living ecosystem, a working river that supported fish populations, attracted birds, and sustained communities along its banks. Salmon ran upstream to spawn, and fishermen made their livings from the river's bounty. The water was clean enough that people occasionally swam in it. Not everywhere, not all the time, but it was at least conceivable. The Thames was London's lifeline, providing food, transportation, and recreation. Industrialisation destroyed that. Factories dumped chemical waste directly into the river, tanneries released toxic compounds, slaughterhouses poured blood and offal into the water. And as London's population exploded, human waste overwhelmed whatever natural filtration capacity the river possessed. By the mid-19th century, the Thames was an ecological disaster, a dead zone where nothing lived except bacteria and algae. The fish disappeared first. Salmon, which require clean, oxygen-rich water, vanished entirely. Then other species followed: eels, perch, dace. Even the hardiest fish couldn't survive in water that toxic. The absence of fish meant birds left too. Herons, kingfishers and waterfowl all depended on the river for food. When their food source disappeared, so did they. The Thames became silent, ecologically speaking. No fish jumped, no birds dove, just brown water flowing slowly through the city, carrying death rather than life. Aquatic plants died off. The riverbed, once covered with vegetation that filtered water and provided habitat, became barren mud. At low tide, the exposed flats were sterile, toxic wastelands where nothing grew. The entire ecosystem had collapsed, transformed from a complex web of life into a simplified system dominated by anaerobic bacteria, organisms that thrive in oxygen-free environments, the only things capable of surviving in such polluted water. But here's the remarkable part. Once the sewers diverted waste and water quality began improving, the river started healing. It didn't happen overnight. Recovery took decades, requiring not just Bazalgette sewers, but also subsequent improvements in water treatment, industrial regulation, and environmental protection. But gradually, life returned. The first signs were small. In the early 20th century, observers noted that the water smelled slightly less foul. Chemical tests showed slowly increasing oxygen levels. By mid-century, scientists detected signs of aquatic invertebrates, small creatures like worms and insects that could tolerate moderately polluted water. These weren't glamorous species, but they mattered. They signalled that the river was supporting life again, even if just barely. As treatment plants improved and industries cleaned up their discharge, water quality continued rising. By the 1970s, fish began reappearing. First, hardy species like roach and dace that can tolerate less than perfect conditions. Then gradually, more sensitive species returned. Eels came back in significant numbers. And in 1974, a salmon was caught in the Thames for the first time in over a century. It was a shock. Salmon are indicator species, present only in relatively clean water. Their return was proof that the Thames was genuinely recovering. Birds followed the fish. Herons returned to nest along the banks. Kingfishers were spotted diving for prey. Cormorants, grebes and ducks repopulated sections of the river. The Thames became, once again, a haven for wildlife, not pristine, but alive. Today, our over 125 species of fish live in the Thames, along with countless birds, and even seals occasionally swim upstream from the North Sea. The recovery wasn't natural or passive. It required constant human intervention, sewage treatment, pollution controls, environmental monitoring. The Thames is an urban river flowing through one of the world's largest cities. It will never be wilderness. Runoff, overflow events, and human activity continue affecting water quality. But the difference between the dead river of 1858 and the living ecosystem of today is staggering. There are even otters now. Otters! These playful, fish-eating mammals require clean water and abundant prey. They're considered indicator species for healthy river ecosystems. and they're living in the Thames in London, and raising families along the same river that once killed everything it touched. It's almost miraculous. The Thames recovery teaches several lessons. First, ecological damage, even severe damage, isn't always permanent. With intervention, care and time, ecosystems can heal. Second, recovery requires long-term commitment. It took over a century of continuous effort to restore the Thames. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes, just decades of steady improvement. Third, urban rivers can support biodiversity. Cities and nature aren't mutually exclusive. With proper management, even heavily modified waterways can host thriving ecosystems. But the Thames also reminds us that recovery is fragile. Climate change, population growth and aging infrastructure all threaten to undo progress. Some combined sewer overflows still occasionally dump untreated waste into the river during heavy storms. Chemical contamination from pharmaceuticals and microplastics is an emerging concern. The Thames is healthier than it's been in 2 centuries, but it's not safe from future threats. Environmental monitoring continues constantly. Scientists test water quality, track fish populations, and watch for signs of decline. When problems arise, regulators intervene quickly. The Thames has become a test case for urban river management, studied by cities worldwide trying to restore their own polluted waterways. The salmon swimming in the Thames today are descendants of fish that fled the river's pollution generations ago. They found refuge in cleaner tributaries and coastal waters, waiting for conditions to improve. And when they did, slowly, the salmon returned. It's a powerful metaphor. Nature is patient. It'll wait for us to stop destroying it. And when we finally do, it comes back, tentatively at first, then abundantly. The Thames lost almost everything, but it gained something too. Proof that even our worst mistakes can be corrected if we're willing to put in the work. So there you have it. The Great Stink of 1858. The summer London literally couldn't function because it smelled so bad that politicians fled their own workplace. A crisis so overwhelming, so disgusting, so utterly unavoidable that it finally forced a city to confront decades of denial, neglect, and spectacularly bad planning. It's not a story of knights or conquerors. There are no dramatic battles, no stirring speeches that change the course of nations. Just a river full of sewage, a heatwave that made everything worse, and a city that finally had to admit, we've been living in our own filth for too long, and something has to change. But what emerged from that crisis was extraordinary. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers transformed London from a disease-ridden nightmare into a modern city. They defeated cholera, cleaned the Thames, and created infrastructure that still functions over 150 years later. They proved that engineering could save more lives than medicine. That infrastructure mattered more than monuments, and that sometimes the most important work is the work nobody sees. The people of Victorian London endured things we can barely imagine. They drank contaminated water, watched children die from preventable diseases, and lived with smells so foul that even describing them feels inadequate. They worked in conditions that would horrify us today. They suffered through epidemics, endured neglect from leaders who should have protected them, and somehow kept going, raising families, building communities, and eventually demanding better. And they got better. Not immediately, not perfectly, not equally, but gradually, brick by brick, tunnel by tunnel, London transformed. The river that had been a flowing sewer became home to fish and birds again. The streets that had reeked of death became clean. The water that had killed thousands became safe to drink. It took decades, required constant investment, and demanded the kind of long-term thinking that's always difficult for societies to maintain. But it happened. Tonight, as you settle into your clean bed, in your ventilated room, in a world where you can turn on a tap without fear and flush a toilet without thinking, take just a moment to appreciate how remarkable that is. How many people throughout history would have considered it miraculous to have clean water delivered directly to their homes, to have waste disappear at the pull of a chain, to live in cities where disease isn't an annual visitor that might carry off half the neighbourhood? None of it is automatic, none of it is guaranteed. Every pipe, every treatment plant, every sewer tunnel is the result of someone making a choice to invest in the future. Someone deciding that the unglamorous work of keeping cities functional matters more than the glamorous work of building monuments to ego. So maybe whisper a quiet thank you to Joseph Bazalgette, who designed sewers to last centuries because he understood that infrastructure is an investment across generations, to the navvies who dug tunnels in the dark, risking their lives to build systems they'd never see completed, to the politicians who, however reluctantly, finally did the right thing, to the journalists who refused to let the crisis be forgotten or ignored, and to all the forgotten workers who maintain these systems today, the engineers, the technicians, the labourers who keep civilization functioning while the rest of us sleep. Because history may be gross and terrifying, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and capable of remarkable things. We'll ignore problems until they literally stink. We'll procrastinate until crisis forces action. But when we finally commit, is when we stop making excuses and start building solutions, we can transform cities, defeat diseases, and create infrastructure that outlasts empires. The Great Stink was London's rock bottom, the moment when denial became impossible and action became inevitable. But it was also London's transformation, the crisis that forced a city to build the foundations of modernity. And those foundations are still there, still working, still proving that sometimes progress requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that we've been doing things wrong and we need to do better. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, breathing clean air and resting in comfort that would astound your ancestors, remember that civilization is fragile. It requires maintenance, investment, and the willingness to do boring, essential work that nobody celebrates. It requires each generation to care for the infrastructure they inherit and improve it for the generations to come. The sewers are still flowing, the Thames is alive again, and London stands as proof that even the worst crises, the grossest chapters, the most humiliating failures can become catalysts for transformation, if we're brave enough to admit we have a problem and committed enough to actually fix it. Sleep well. Dream peacefully. And tomorrow, when you flush your toilet without thinking, maybe take just 1 second to appreciate the quiet miracle of modern plumbing, because beneath your feet, buried in tunnels you'll never see, infrastructure is working. And that's not boring. That's everything. Good night.